In the small, isolated village of Ravensbrook, a dark legend haunted the shadows. The villagers spoke in hushed tones about the spirit of a vengeful ghost said to roam the night, seeking those who wronged her. Some dismissed it as a myth, but most feared that speaking her name would invite the curse of her wrath. Years ago, Anne had been a quiet and kind woman. She lived on the outskirts of the village in a crumbling old house near the woods. The villagers rarely spoke to her, but she had a secret love for a man named Thomas. They would meet in secret, far from prying eyes. But Thomas was engaged to another woman, Sarah, the daughter of the wealthiest family in Ravensbrook. When Sarah discovered the affair, she devised a plan to get rid of Anne forever. She spread a rumor that Anne was a witch, that she had bewitched Thomas into loving her. In those days, accusations of witchcraft were not taken lightly. The villagers, fueled by fear and jealousy, stormed Anne's house one stormy night, dragging her out into the rain. Pleading for her life, Anne denied the accusations, but the villagers had made up their minds. They tied her to a tree in the middle of the woods, leaving her to die alone, shivering and cold. Before the last breath left her body, Anne swore a curse, "I will return, and I will make them pay." Decades passed, and Ravensbrook grew quiet, but the night of the curse was not forgotten. On stormy evenings, when the wind howled through the trees and the rain pelted the rooftops, villagers reported strange occurrences. A shadowy figure, pale and drenched in water, would appear at their windows. The trees in the forest would creak with a sinister whisper, and the air grew cold, as if death itself had returned. One fateful evening, Sarah's granddaughter, Emily, returned to Ravensbrook. She had heard stories of her grandmother's cruelty, and though she didn't believe in the supernatural, something about the legend of Anne intrigued her. One night, while exploring the woods near the village, Emily found herself near the very tree where Anne had died. As the wind picked up and the storm rolled in, Emily felt an unnatural chill run down her spine. From the corner of her eye, she saw a figure standing in the shadows, watching her. Turning, she saw a woman with long, wet hair and hollow, dark eyes. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her clothes were torn and soaked as if she had just crawled from a watery grave. "Leave," the ghostly woman whispered, her voice raspy and distant. But Emily couldn't move. She stood frozen as the ghost of Anne approached her. "You are Sarah's blood," Anne said, her voice echoing in the wind. "And for that, you must suffer as I did." Suddenly, Emily found herself unable to breathe, her lungs filling with water though she was nowhere near a body of water. Gasping and choking, she collapsed to the ground. As her vision blurred, she saw Anne standing over her, a wicked smile on her face. But just as Emily felt the life slipping from her, a sudden flash of light pierced the darkness. The ghost of Anne shrieked and disappeared into the storm. Emily awoke the next morning at the foot of the tree, drenched but alive. She ran back to the village, determined to put an end to the curse once and for all. She gathered what remained of the old records and learned of Anne's love for Thomas and the betrayal that led to her death. Emily knew the only way to end Anne's torment was to make peace. That night, Emily returned to the tree, bringing with her the locket Thomas had given Anne, a symbol of their love that had been hidden in Sarah's belongings for years. As she placed the locket on the ground and spoke words of forgiveness for her grandmother's sins, the wind died down, and the woods grew still. For the first time in decades, the villagers felt a sense of calm. The ghost of Anne was never seen again, but the villagers would never forget the terror that haunted their village. The legend of Anne lived on, a reminder that the past can never be buried, and that revenge, even from beyond the grave, is a force to be reckoned with. But on stormy nights, when the wind howls through Ravensbrook, some say they can still hear Anne's whisper on the wind, warning those who dare to wrong another, "Beware the ghost of Anne." The village of Ravensbrook sat nestled in a valley of rolling hills, its streets lined with crooked, moss-covered cottages that seemed to lean into the mist that constantly clung to the air. Time moved slowly in this forgotten corner of the world, but there was one thing the villagers never forgot: the legend of Anne, a woman whose tragic end and vengeful spirit haunted their memories and the shadows that lurked in the woods beyond. For generations, the story of Anne had been told, whispered at night when the wind howled through the narrow streets and the forest creaked ominously in the distance. Anne, once a kind and quiet woman, had lived on the outskirts of the village in a crumbling house near the woods. She was known for her gentle nature and her love of the wild herbs and plants she would gather in the forest, crafting remedies that the villagers relied on. But despite her helpfulness, Anne was a solitary figure, rarely seen in the village except on market days when she would sell her wares. The villagers spoke of her in quiet tones, some grateful for her knowledge of herbs, while others regarded her with suspicion. She was, after all, an outsider, someone who lived apart from the rest, someone who kept to herself. And in a village like Ravensbrook, isolation bred fear. What the villagers did not know was that Anne harbored a secret. Her heart belonged to a man named Thomas, a handsome and charming farmer who lived near the center of the village. Their love had blossomed in secret, away from prying eyes and judgmental whispers. They would meet in the forest, far from the village, where no one would see them together. There, under the canopy of trees, they shared stolen moments of happiness, free from the constraints of the world that separated them. But Thomas was not free to love Anne. He was engaged to Sarah, the daughter of the wealthiest family in the village, a woman as cold and calculating as she was beautiful. Their marriage had been arranged long ago, and Thomas, bound by duty and expectation, could not defy it. Though his heart belonged to Anne, he knew he could never be with her. When Sarah discovered the truth, her rage was swift and terrible. She was not the type to allow another woman to take what was hers, especially not someone like Anne, a mere herbalist who lived in a dilapidated house on the edge of the woods. Sarah's pride was wounded, and in her anger, she devised a plan that would rid her of Anne once and for. She began to spread rumors. Whispers in the marketplace, quiet words shared with the village priest, subtle hints dropped in conversations. Soon, the villagers began to talk about Anne's strange ways, her knowledge of herbs, her solitary life in the woods. They began to wonder if perhaps Anne was more than just a healer. Perhaps she was a witch. It did not take long for the fear to grow. Ravensbrook was a superstitious place, and the idea of a witch living among them, casting spells and cursing those who crossed her, was enough to send the villagers into a frenzy. The whispers grew louder, and soon the entire village believed that Anne was a danger to them all. One stormy night, when the wind howled and the rain lashed against the windows, the villagers gathered. Armed with torches and pitchforks, they marched to Anne's house, their faces twisted with fear and anger. Anne, startled by the sudden commotion, opened her door to find the mob standing before her, their eyes wild with hatred. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice shaking. "You," one of the men spat, stepping forward. "We know what you are, witch. You've cursed this village with your dark magic." Anne's heart raced. She had no idea what they were talking about. "I'm no witch," she protested. "I've done nothing but help you all. The herbs, the remedies." "Lies." Sarah's voice cut through the crowd like a blade. She stepped forward, her beautiful face twisted into a sneer. "You bewitched my fiancé, you evil hag. You lured him into the woods with your spells and potions. You've cursed this village with your wickedness." Anne's eyes widened in horror. "No, that's not true," she whispered, but the villagers weren't listening. Their fear had already turned to rage. Before she could say another word, they grabbed her, dragging her out into the rain. And screamed, struggling against their grip, but it was no use. They were too many, and their minds were set. They dragged her through the village, past the cottages where people peeked out from behind their curtains, too afraid to intervene. They took her to the edge of the forest, to the old oak tree that stood tall and twisted like an ancient sentinel. There, they tied her to the tree, her wrists bound tightly with rough ropes. Anne's tears mixed with the rain as she pleaded with them, begging for her life, but the villagers were deaf to her cries. "Let this be a lesson to all who dare to practice witchcraft in Ravensbrook," Sarah declared, her voice rising above the storm. "And you will die here tonight, and with you, the evil you have brought to our village." The villagers stepped back, watching as Anne struggled against her bonds. The rain fell harder, drenching her, but there was no mercy in their eyes. They left her there, tied to the tree, as the storm raged on. As the night wore on, Anne's strength began to fade. Her cries grew weaker, her body trembling from the cold and the rain. But before she took her last breath, she made a vow, a curse that would echo through the ages. "I will return," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the howling wind. "I will return, and I will make you all pay." And with that, Anne died. For years, Ravensbrook was quiet. The village moved on, the memory of Anne fading into legend. But as time passed, strange things began to happen. On stormy nights, when the wind howled through the trees and the rain pounded the rooftops, villagers reported seeing a figure in the woods, a woman, her hair long and wet, her eyes dark and hollow. She would stand at the edge of the forest, watching, waiting. And then, people began to disappear. It started with the man who had tied the ropes around Anne's wrists. One night, during a storm, he went into the woods to gather firewood. He never came back. His body was found the next morning, his face frozen in a mask of terror, his skin cold and pale as if he had drowned, though there was no water nearby. After that, more people vanished. Those who had been part of the mob that had condemned and met similar fates found dead in the woods, their bodies drenched as if they had been pulled from the depths of a river. The villagers were terrified, but no one spoke of Anne. They were too afraid that speaking her name would bring her wrath down upon them. Years passed, and the terror subsided. The deaths stopped, and the village slowly returned to normal. But the legend of Anne, the ghost who haunted the woods, remained. Parents would tell their children to stay away from the forest, warning them that Anne was still out there, waiting for those who crossed her. But not everyone believed in the legend. Emily, Sarah's granddaughter, returned to Ravensbrook one autumn. She had heard the stories of her grandmother's role in Anne's death, but she dismissed them as superstition, nothing more than a ghost story meant to frighten children. She was a modern woman, a city dweller, and she didn't have time for such nonsense. One night, curious about the truth behind the legend, Emily ventured into the woods. She had always been fascinated by the stories of her grandmother Anne, and she wanted to see the tree where Anne had died for herself. Armed with nothing but a flashlight, she made her way through the dense forest, the air heavy with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. As she walked deeper into the woods, the wind began to pick up, the trees swaying and creaking ominously. Emily shivered, pulling her coat tighter around her, but she pressed on. After what felt like hours, she finally reached the clearing where the old oak tree stood. The tree was massive, its gnarled branches reaching out like twisted arms. Emily could almost imagine Anne tied to the trunk, her eyes wide with fear as the villagers condemned her to die. She shook the thought from her mind and approached the tree, running her hand over the rough bark. Suddenly, the wind howled louder, and Emily felt a chill run down her spine. She turned, her flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, and froze. There, standing at the edge of the clearing, was a woman. Her hair was long and wet, clinging to her face in dark strands. Her eyes were empty, black holes that seemed to swallow the light. Her clothes were torn and soaked, hanging off her pale, translucent skin. The woman stood silently, watching Emily with a cold, unblinking gaze. Who are you?" Emily whispered, her voice trembling. The woman took a step forward, her feet making no sound as they moved through the wet leaves. "Leave," she whispered, her voice hollow and distant. "Leave this place." Emily backed away, her heart pounding in her chest. She turned to run, but her feet wouldn't move. It was as if the ground had frozen beneath her, trapping her in place. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. The woman moved. Ravensbrook was the kind of village where time seemed to stand still. Nestled in a valley surrounded by rolling hills and thick forests, the village was cut off from the rest of the world, wrapped in a perpetual shroud of mist. The cobblestone streets were narrow, winding between crooked cottages whose thatched roofs were dark with age. The people who lived in Ravensbrook were a superstitious folk, their lives governed by the rhythms of the land and the seasons. They clung to their old ways, passing down stories and traditions from generation to generation. But of all the stories told in Ravensbrook, none was more feared, more whispered about in hushed tones, than the tale of Anne. Her name was a curse, a shadow that lingered over the village, and her tragic fate had become legend. For Anne was not like the other women of the village. She had lived on the outskirts, in a small, weathered cottage at the edge of the forest, far from the watchful eyes of the villagers. And it was there, in the lonely silence of her home, that her story had begun. Anne was a healer, skilled in the use of herbs and plants to treat the ailments of the villagers. She knew the secret properties of the flowers and roots that grew in the dense forest, and she had a reputation for curing even the most stubborn illnesses. Despite her talents, however, Anne was a solitary figure. She had no family, no close friends, and few ventured to her home unless they were in need of her remedies. Her isolation made her the subject of gossip, and in a village like Ravensbrook, where conformity was prized and anything different was viewed with suspicion, and was often the target of whispered rumors. The villagers respected her skills but feared her all the same. Some said she had the look of a witch about her, her eyes were too bright, her hair too wild, her knowledge of the forest too deep. They said she spoke to the trees, that she could summon the spirits of the earth to do her bidding. Others claimed she had made a pact with dark forces, that her cures came at a price not paid by her patients but by their souls. But these were only rumors, spread by people who did not understand her, and had long since learned to ignore them. What the villagers did not know was that Anne harbored a secret. She was in love. The object of her affection was Thomas, a farmer who lived in the heart of the village. He was tall and strong, with kind eyes and a warm smile that made Anne's heart flutter whenever she saw him. For years, she had watched him from afar, content to admire him in silence, knowing that someone like her, an outcast, a healer, someone who lived on the fringes of society, could never hope to win his love. But fate, as it often does, had other plans. One autumn afternoon, Thomas had wandered too far into the forest while gathering firewood. Lost and disoriented, he stumbled upon Anne's cottage just as the sun was beginning to set. Anne had been sitting on the porch, sorting through the herbs she had gathered that day, when she saw him emerge from the trees. His clothes were torn, his face streaked with dirt, and he looked utterly exhausted. "Can I help you?" Anne had asked, her voice soft and tentative. Thomas had looked at her, relief flooding his features. "I'm lost," he admitted. "I didn't realize how far I'd gone. Could you tell me the way back to the village?" Anne had hesitated, her heart pounding in her chest. It was the first time she had spoken to him directly, and the intensity of her feelings for him made her nervous. But she nodded, standing up and brushing the dirt from her hands. "I can show you the way," she said. "But you must be tired. Come inside for a moment. I'll get you something to drink." Thomas had gratefully accepted, and that was how it began. Over the following weeks, he returned to her cottage, sometimes under the pretense of needing more herbs for his family, other times simply to talk. Their conversations were easy, flowing like the streams that ran through the forest, and soon a deep connection grew between them. Anne found herself falling deeper in love with him, and she sensed that Thomas felt the same. But there was a problem. Thomas was engaged to Sarah, the daughter of the wealthiest family in Ravensbrook. Sarah was everything and was not beautiful, elegant, and socially connected. She was the darling of the village, admired and envied in equal measure. Her engagement to Thomas had been arranged by their families, and it was seen as the perfect match. But beneath her flawless exterior, Sarah was a cold and calculating woman. She cared nothing for Thomas, viewing him only as a means to an end, a way to secure her position and increase her family's wealth. And when she began to suspect that Thomas's affections lay elsewhere, her jealousy ignited a fire that would consume them all. One evening, as a storm gathered on the horizon, Sarah followed Thomas into the forest. She had seen him slip away from the village earlier, his expression furtive, and she knew where he was going. For weeks, rumors had reached her ears, whispers of Thomas's visits to the healer's cottage, of his growing attachment to, and Sarah had dismissed them at first, convinced that no one, especially not someone like him, could threaten her. But now, watching Thomas disappear into the trees, her suspicions were confirmed. She waited until he was out of sight before following. The forest was dark, the air thick with the scent of rain, and Sarah's heart pounded with a mixture of anger and anticipation. She would confront Thomas, and she would confront Anne. She would end this, once and for all. When she reached Anne's cottage, she hid in the shadows, watching as Thomas knocked on the door. And appeared moments later, her face lighting up when she saw him. Sarah's eyes narrowed, her lips curling into a sneer as she watched them embrace. "This is what you've been doing, Thomas?" Sarah whispered to herself, her voice venomous. "Sneaking away like a common thief to be with that witch?" Her mind raced, and she began to formulate a plan. She would not confront them, not yet. No, she would strike at them in a way they would never see coming. The next day, Sarah began spreading rumors. She told the village priest that she had seen Anne performing strange rituals in the forest, that she had overheard her chanting in a language no one could understand. She whispered to the blacksmith's wife that Anne had bewitched Thomas, that she had used dark magic to ensnare his heart. The rumors spread like wildfire, and soon the entire village was buzzing with talk of witchcraft. In Ravensbrook, such accusations were dangerous. The village had a long history of superstition, and the fear of witches was deeply ingrained in the minds of its people. It wasn't long before the villagers, already suspicious of Anne, began to turn on her. They stopped coming to her for remedies, they crossed the street to avoid her, and they began to whisper behind her back whenever she passed by. Anne was oblivious to the growing hostility. She was too consumed by her love for Thomas, too caught up in the stolen moments they shared in the forest. But Thomas was not blind to the change in the villagers' behavior. He had heard the rumors, and though he dismissed them as nonsense, he could not shake the feeling that something terrible was brewing. One night, as the storm clouds gathered once more, the villagers gathered in the village square. Sarah stood at the center, her eyes gleaming with triumph as she addressed the crowd. "We cannot allow this witch to live among us," she declared, her voice ringing out over the sound of the approaching storm. "Anne has used her dark powers to seduce Thomas and curse this village. If we do not act, who knows what evil she will bring upon us all?" The villagers, already terrified by the rumors, were quick to agree. They grabbed torches and pitchforks and marched toward Anne's cottage, their faces twisted with fear and anger. Thomas tried to stop them, tried to reason with them, but it was no use. Their minds were made up. When they reached Anne's cottage, they found her standing in the doorway, her face pale with confusion and fear. "What is this?" she asked, her voice trembling. "What have I done?" "You're a witch," one of the villagers shouted. "You've cursed us all." Anne shook her head, her heart pounding in her chest. "No," she whispered. "I've done nothing but help you all. The herbs, the remedies, they're not magic. They're just plants." "Lies!" Sarah screamed, stepping forward. "You bewitched Thomas, you evil witch. You lured him into the forest with your dark magic, and now you must pay." Before Anne could respond, the villagers surged forward, grabbing her and dragging her out into the rain. She screamed, struggling against their grip, but they were too strong. They dragged her through the forest to the old oak tree at its heart, the same tree where she and Thomas had shared so many of their secret moments. There, they tied her to the tree, her wrists bound tightly with rough ropes. Anne's tears mixed with the rain as she pleaded with them, begging for mercy, but their hearts were cold. Sarah stood before her, a wicked smile on her face as she raised her torch. Let this be a lesson to all who would defy the will of Ravensbrook, she declared, her voice cutting through the storm like a blade.